She asked for special treatment. We obliged. Back in the distant before times of 2015, while I was working my way through nursing school, I supported myself by waitressing at a restaurant. It wasn't just any restaurant, either. The owners took immense pride in the fact that they didn't advertise. Not on television, not online, not in newspapers. Their reputation was built entirely through word of mouth. Customers recommended us to friends, those friends recommended us to their friends, and that's how the business thrived. That detail becomes important later. By this point, I had already been working there for several months. I had proven myself reliable enough that management often trusted me to help new hires find their footing after the official trainers had finished with them. I wasn't technically a trainer myself, but whenever a new server needed someone experienced nearby to answer questions, cover mistakes, or help them survive a difficult shift, I was usually one of the people management paired them with. Around that time, we had hired an older gentleman who had recently been released from prison. He was quiet, a little socially awkward, and constantly worried about making mistakes. None of that was unusual for someone starting a new job, especially after everything he had been through. In fact, he was wonderful to work with. He listened carefully, worked hard, and genuinely wanted to do a good job. On the night this story takes place, he was assigned the section right next to mine. It was the perfect setup. I could easily keep an eye on him, and if he got overwhelmed, I could jump in before things spiraled out of control. This was his first shift managing a full section entirely on his own, so I fully expected him to get weeded at some point. That's normal. Every server gets weeded eventually. What neither of us expected was the table he ended up with. A party of about 6 20-somethings was seated in his section. From the moment they sat down, they radiated the kind of energy that makes restaurant staff immediately nervous. Not long after they were seated, he approached me looking confused and concerned. "They want something that's not on the menu," he said. "At least I don't think it's on the menu. One of the women says we have all the ingredients and that the other location makes it for her all the time." Could I have used this as a teaching moment and shown him how to politely but firmly stand his ground? Sure. But this was his first independent shift, his nerves were already frayed, and I knew that confrontation wasn't likely to go well. Instead, I told him to check with the kitchen. If the cooks were willing to make it, great. If they weren't, I'd handle the conversation myself. Fortunately, the kitchen didn't mind. If I remember correctly, it was some kind of wrap that could easily be assembled from ingredients we already had. It wasn't a problem for us. Unfortunately, it became the beginning of a problem for him. Apparently, getting her special off-menu meal convinced the woman leading the table that she could demand absolutely anything she wanted. From that point forward, every single time he approached the table, she needed something else. The moment he delivered one request, another appeared. Bring napkins? She needed extra sauce. Bring extra sauce? She wanted a refill. Bring the refill? Suddenly she needed something else entirely. It never stopped. I'd already been keeping an eye on him, but when I caught the look of growing panic on his face, I gave him a reassuring nod and quietly started helping with his other tables. I folded his guests into my own service rotation and began checking on them whenever I passed through the section. That's exactly why experienced servers were paired with new hires in the first place. Meanwhile, the demanding table continued monopolizing his attention. The woman in charge never seemed satisfied. She wasn't patient. She wasn't understanding. She wasn't even polite. Every interaction felt like a test designed to make him fail. Whenever I caught him in the back of the restaurant, I tried to calm him down. I reminded him that difficult guests happen to every server. I warned him that a table like this might not leave a tip no matter how hard he worked. Most importantly, I assured him that I was keeping his other tables happy and that I wouldn't touch a single dollar of whatever tips they left. Honestly, the poor man looked like he was ready to quit on the spot. He was completely rattled. Watching it happen made me even angrier because he was at least twice my age, and I could tell how embarrassed he felt about the whole situation. The group had arrived fairly late in the evening and ended up staying well past the time our section officially closed. By the end of the night, they were the only remaining table on our entire side of the restaurant. Because I was closing alongside the new server, I had already finished most of my duties early and was nearby when he approached me again. This time, his question completely caught me off guard. He asked how to process an employee discount. Then he asked whether multiple employee discounts could be combined on a single check. I blinked. "Wait," I said. "Employee?" That's when he told me the rest of the story. Throughout the entire meal, The woman had been informing him that she was a trainer at another location in our restaurant chain. Not only that, but she had spent the evening mocking him, criticizing him, and telling him he was the worst server she had ever seen. Suddenly, everything made sense. Of course the other location made her custom meals. Of course she felt entitled to special treatment. And of course this poor guy looked like he'd survived a natural disaster. As if that weren't enough, she had also announced that multiple people at the table were celebrating birthdays and therefore deserved complimentary cakes. She wanted all of the free desserts and demanded the birthday song immediately. The longest 3 months of my life. Back in the 2000s, when I was a freshly minted 18-year-old with more optimism than experience, I landed my first real job in the Canadian oil patch. For a kid with no degree, no certifications, and no real work history, it felt like winning the lottery. The position paid around $20 an hour at a time when minimum wage was still under $6. Most people my age were working retail or fast food. I was heading into the oil fields. The job was called well testing. In simple terms, our crew would set up equipment on newly drilled oil and gas wells, connect pressure tanks and flare stacks, get the wells flowing, and collect production data. The setup and teardown were physically demanding, but once everything was running, the work mostly involved monitoring gauges, recording readings, and entering information into a computer. For a first job, it was fantastic. Except for Gary. Crews were typically made up of either 2 people working 12-hour shifts or 4 people covering a 24-hour operation. Each shift had a laborer and a supervisor. I was the laborer. My supervisor was Gary, a mean-spirited alcoholic in his mid-50s. Gary was overweight, lazy, and somehow always able to disappear whenever real work needed to be done. He would only help with tasks that were physically impossible for me to do alone, such as lifting enormous sections of pipe weighing hundreds of pounds. Once the heavy lifting was over, he would retreat into the trailer where he spent most of his day watching DVDs, taking naps, and occasionally pretending to work by typing a few numbers into a computer every hour. He also loved making jokes. By jokes, I mean insults. I was over 6 feet tall, so I wasn't physically intimidated by him, but I was young, lacked confidence, and still had a baby face. Gary quickly decided I was an easy target. He called me stupid constantly. One day he discovered I had never used a power drill before. "Didn't your dad teach you anything?" he asked. Unfortunately, I made the mistake of telling him that my father had only been in my life for a few years before disappearing. Not long afterward, I made a minor mistake on the job. Gary smirked and said, "No wonder your dad walked out on you." Even then, I knew that crossed a line. When I called him out, he responded exactly the way every bully responds. "Can't you take a joke?" We worked far from civilization most of the time. The job often took us into rural areas where the only restaurants were tiny bars in small towns. Gary drank every chance he got. Strangely enough, after a couple of drinks he could actually be pleasant company. The problem was that he never stopped at a couple of drinks. Soon it became routine for me to drive us to work. We traveled anywhere from 100 to 350 kilometers a day. Gary received mileage compensation for using his truck. I got minimum wage during travel time. Despite being paid for the vehicle, Gary preferred sleeping in the passenger seat while I drove. Most mornings he was hungover. Most mornings he claimed he was the boss. Most mornings he slept like a corpse until we arrived at the work site. I endured this for 3 months. 3 months of insults. 3 months of disrespect. 3 months of verbal abuse. I had dealt with bullying before in my life, so my response was usually the same: I stayed quiet. But everyone has a breaking point. Mine finally arrived during a trip out of town. We were having dinner when I casually mentioned that it seemed unfair he was being paid mileage while I was doing most of the driving. I suggested he throw me a few dollars occasionally. Gary reacted as though I had demanded ownership of his house. He exploded. The insults became worse than usual. Then he threatened my job. By the end of the conversation I was angry, humiliated, and completely fed up. I decided that even if nothing else happened, I needed to get away from him. I had already been keeping notes because I wanted a transfer to another crew. That night, something changed. My patience ran out. The next morning fate handed me an opportunity. As usual, Gary was asleep in the truck while I drove toward the worksite. About 30 kilometers away, I noticed a semi-truck parked at a roadside pullout. The engine was running, and the driver happened to be standing outside. An idea formed instantly. I pulled over. Gary remained asleep. The truck driver listened to my request, laughed, and agreed to help. He climbed back into his semi and waited for my signal. Meanwhile, I carefully repositioned Gary's truck so that we were facing the massive Peterbilt almost bumper to bumper. Gary never noticed. He was still sleeping off the previous night's whiskey. I gave the signal. The trucker answered. His headlights flashed. Then he leaned on the air horn with the enthusiasm of a man who truly appreciated chaos. At the exact same moment, I laid on the horn in Gary's truck and started screaming at the top of my lungs. "We're gonna die." The combined noise was unbelievable. The horn from the semi. The horn from the pickup. My screaming. It sounded like the end of the world. The entire performance lasted less than a minute. It was magnificent. Gary launched upward with enough force to nearly hit the roof. His eyes were huge. His face cycled through confusion, terror, and pure panic faster than I thought humanly possible. Then realization arrived. Terror became rage. The noises coming out of him were somewhere between screaming and choking. I reversed the truck and pulled away before he decided to test whether he could actually kill me. The truck driver got a grateful wave as we left. About 10 meters down the road, Gary informed me that he suffered from dangerously high blood pressure and that I could have caused a stroke. Years later, after attending paramedic school, I realized he may actually have had a point. At 18, however, I had no idea what a stroke even was. So instead of apologizing, I laughed. Hard. Then I asked him the question he had used on me countless times before. "Can't you take a joke?" That made everything worse. Gary tried issuing threats. He tried yelling. He tried explaining how serious the situation was. Unfortunately, the angrier he became, the funnier I found it. For the remaining 20 minutes of the drive, I laughed almost non-stop. At one point I even asked whether that was his normal shade of red. When we finally reached the site, Gary ordered me out of the truck, declared that I was fired, and stormed away to call the company owner. Honestly, I didn't care. I sat around smoking cigarettes and enjoying what I assumed would be my final day with the company. Several hours later, the owner arrived to pick me up. Gary had apparently presented a version of events that made me sound like a criminal mastermind and possibly the Antichrist. During the drive back to the city, I explained everything that had led up to the incident. To my surprise, the owner laughed. A lot. He agreed that Gary had been making life miserable for everyone around him. No, he didn't approve of my methods. But he definitely appreciated the story. In the end, I wasn't fired. Instead, I was transferred to a different crew. Gary and I never worked together again. I stayed with the company until I eventually returned to school. As a bonus, the story spread around the workplace and earned me a surprising amount of respect from the other workers. After months of abuse from my supervisor, I convinced him he was about to die in a head-on collision with a semi-truck. He was not amused. Everyone else was.